married and they choose to both the husband and wife get jobs without having any kids. So the word dink, it means, it's a funny word, but it means dual income, so two incomes, no kids. So that's a thing. Adam and Eve, God did not want them to be dinks. He wanted them to be whatever the polar opposite of dinks is. He wanted them to have tons of kids. He wanted them to reproduce and have lots of kids so that the earth would be full of image bearers of God. This idea was born out in a number of different places, but we see this same concept within the land of Egypt. So within the land of Egypt, Pharaoh, he would put statues of himself at the far edges of the land of Egypt. Why? So that when people came to those edges, they would recognize, wait a second, I'm entering into a territory that's governed by Pharaoh. I find his image, something that bears his image, and I found out whose world I'm living in. And so this is the same idea that God is doing by creating people. He wants people to know that this is his world because there's image bearers of his that are governing all over the earth, all to the edges of it. So he says, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Don't just stay in one place. Fill the earth. His second thing he says to them is to subdue and exercise dominion over the creation of the world. So be on the offensive. Okay, we are not passive participants. God does not create people to be passive participants in the world. He wants us to be on the offensive, going out, subduing, and exercising dominion, in this specific context, over the animals that God had made. They were to rule over the animals and not let the animals rule over them. But then they were supposed to go beyond that and again, take God's mission out into the world. So this word, the two words that are translated subdue and exercise dominion in English can be controversial because the word subdue can also be translated enslave. Okay, slavery, controversial topic in 2024. Always been pretty controversial, but it's this idea of enslave. So God wants us to enslave. What in the world are we talking about? What does it mean to enslave? It means to harness either the energy or the strength of an animal or a people or whatever it is, harness their strength and channel it towards a certain purpose. This is what God wants humanity to do. He wants them to take the raw world, the raw animals that are out there, the raw everything that exists, and use them for God's purposes. So then to rule, obviously, to exercise dominion is to rule. And to rule something is to instill your will on it. To say, let my kingdom come. To say, let my will be done. This is what God wants for humans to do. Now, the interesting thing is that those two Hebrew words, the words that are translated here, rule, subdue and exercise dominion, are translated throughout the Bible in describing the work of the kings of Israel or other kings. Kings go in and they subdue their enemies. Kings come in and they exercise dominion. They basically say, you're going to do this. I've conquered you and I'm going to do this. This is part of what God wants us to do as humans. The third thing that he wants us to do, he says, and this is in chapter 2, he says to them, so that's their work in the world. He wants them to go on the offensive. And then within the garden itself, the Garden of Eden, where they would retreat to have fellowship with God, he says to them, guard and keep the garden. He wants them to guard and keep. Now, those two words that are translated, guard and keep, the guard is pretty, obvious. Defend from unholy intruders. Defend from uncleanness that could come into this place, this holy place where God came to be with them. And then to keep is to cultivate and make flourish. God wants them to be diligent within this holy place to keep it holy. And the interesting thing again is that those two Hebrew words that are translated guard and keep are translated throughout the rest of the scriptures in describing the work of the priesthood. So what we see here is that God, in creating people, wants them to be multiplying kingly priests. This is what he wants us to do. Okay? So this is, he creates us to be stewards, to be image bearers. He wants us to be his children. He wants us to love him, trust him as we reproduce and go out into the world, completing his will and bringing into subjection to his will. And then to know and love God and to make his love known so that others will love him too. This is what it means to be human. If you're living your life oriented in other ways or to other ends, you have ceased to live faithfully as a human. You're not humaning correctly if you're not doing these things. This is what God lays out. Now, last part of defining. I promise this is all going someplace. This is the hard work of defining, but once we've defined, then things will be a lot clearer. So, here's a question. What does it mean to love God? We live in a world in which love can mean lots of things. I observed at least the first part of a debate yesterday here. The debate was over the legitimacy of Valentine's Day and whether or not we should celebrate Valentine's Day by giving gifts, or if that was not a good practice to do. And so this idea of, part of the objection was, well, this is a shallow form of love. It's not really great. So the question is, granted, we may not understand love. What does it mean to love God? God wants us to love him. He wants us to love others. What does this mean to love God? Well, part of loving is to acknowledge him and be grateful. In Romans 1, 21 through 23, Paul is describing the nature of sin, and he says that sinful people refuse to acknowledge God as God or be thankful to him. So if you're not acknowledging the God who made you and the God who made the world and everything in it, you're not loving God. You're not recognizing his value, his glory, his fame, his worth. And so God is God. We are not. He sets the agenda and establishes the rules. We do not. So if we can't love God if we're denying these basic things. If we're trying to make ourselves God, where God creates out of thin air, if we're trying to be like him in that way, we're not loving God. We're not God. We are created and made by God, but we are not him. We're supposed to image him, but that does not mean doing everything that he does. So God wants us to love him by acknowledging who he is, acknowledging the reality of the world that he made, acknowledging our own limits, and then recognizing, desiring, and working to see his kingdom come. This is what we just talked about. His will accomplished on earth to the same degree and with the same urgency and delight with which it is sought in heaven, which is, again, with complete devotion in heaven. The angels are constantly crying out and saying, holy, holy, holy. They look at God and they're like, what can we do but praise you? How can we help but want what you want? You're glorious, you're holy, you're perfect, you need nothing. And so this is what God wants to see replicated here. This is what it means to love God. It also means to trust in him by trusting, hearing, and aligning our lives according to how he's designed the world to function. Jesus said in John 14:21, whoever has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me. If we say we love God and we don't keep his commandments, we're a liar. And the truth is not in us, Jesus said. So one of the ways in which we acknowledge and we trust God is by submitting ourselves to this basic law that God made to govern so much of our world. And that's the law of sowing and reaping. Now you probably have heard that before, heard this idea, but it is everywhere. It is everywhere in the Bible. It's just not always phrased like that. So in the end of the book of Galatians, chapter 6, Paul is talking and he says, God is not mocked. There's that word again. God is not mocked, for what a man sows, that will he also reap. Okay? So what Paul says is that to deny a causal relationship between sowing and reaping is to mock God, because that is how he designed the world to function. And it's not just sowing and reaping, it's sowing and exponential reaping. Okay? Now, what's an example of this? So, I've been married. Ben and I found out the other day, we were married the same day in the same year. I don't know what the odds are of that. Not very good. We were married the same day in the same year. Now, both Ben and I, on the day that we married our wives, we knew our wives to a certain degree. We could have told you, basic facts about them, about what they like, what they don't like. Probably not as many as they wish we knew, but we knew to a certain degree things about them. Now, many years later, we know our wives way better. Why? Because we've sowed spending time with them. And so as we spent time with them, we get to know them better. And so our knowledge of our wives is way better now that we've sowed spending time. We've reaped the ability to know our wives better.